Great. Well, I wondered if a simple question to start. If you could give me your simplest definition of evolutionary biology, or sorry, psychology, evolutionary psychology.
So, evolutionary psychology is basically applying principles of evolutionary theory to understand the evolution of the human mind. So, in the same way that, are you there?
Yeah. Hmm.
So, in the same way that evolution is used to explain all biological diversity, right? From how flowers evolve to be how they are, to how animals evolve to be how they are. That's
Sure.
called speciation. To how a particular trait on an animal evolves to be how it is. Why does the uh, peacock have its tail the way that it does? What adaptive purpose did it solve? And so the exact same tools of evolutionary biology that are used to explain everything in biology don't suddenly become irrelevant when we have to understand the most important organ that defines our personhood, which is our brain, our human mind. And so put very simply, evolutionary psychology is the pursuit of understanding the human mind through an evolutionary lens. Now, I can give you some specific tenets of what evolutionary psychology says about the human mind. Would that help?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Now, that of course gets a bit more technical. So first, I was answering your general question. So you'll forgive me if it's a bit more technical. I'll
No,
try to
that's
always.
fine.
Ah, go ahead. Is that okay?
That's totally fine. Yeah.
Okay. So the first thing that evolutionary psychologists would argue is that the same forces of natural selection and sexual selection that are operative to explain everything else in biology. So what do we mean by natural selection? Those are any traits or behaviors that have evolved because they confer survival advantage to an animal.
Sure.
Sexual selection is the evolutionary process by which animals, including of course humans, evolve traits or behaviors that garner reproductive advantage. In other words, in the game of life, there are two things that need to happen. First, I need to survive, but then I need to mate, right? I can only extend my genes if both of those things happen. If I just survive but can never find a mate, then I'm a Darwinian dead end. And so natural selection and sexual selection are operative in understanding how the human mind would have evolved. And so the idea becomes trying to uncover what are the types of adaptive problems that humans would have faced recurringly in their past that would necessitate that the human mind would evolve specific computational systems to solve specific adaptive problems. And here we have to understand an important distinction, which goes to the heart of evolutionary psychology. So, evolutionary psychologists argue that the human mind is an amalgamation of both domain general mechanisms and domain specific mechanisms.
Hmm.
Domain general mechanisms are things like intelligence, right? Your intelligence is something that can be transported across domains. Your intelligence can be used to solve a calculus problem, and it can also be used for you to obtain your MBA at Oxford. It could be used to read literature. It could be used for all sorts of reasons, all sorts of things. That's called a domain general mechanism. Now, most psychologists have typically uncovered only these types of mechanisms in our brain. What evolutionary psychologists add to the story is that they argue that the human mind is also comprised of domain specific mechanisms. Now, what does that mean? Think about, say, the Swiss Army knife, right? The Swiss Army knife
Hmm.
is, if you know what that is,
Yeah.
is a knife that has many different types of blades. One blade is to take off the cork from a wine bottle. Another one is to cut cheese. Another one, right? It's not one domain general knife which can be used for many different functions. Rather, the Swiss Army knife has different blades, each of which solves one specific problem. So now taking this metaphor to the human mind, so the human mind would also have specific computational systems to solve specific adaptive problems, avoid predators, seek nutritious foods, avoid poisonous foods, uh, find mate, retain mate, invest in kin, build coalitions. All of these adaptive problems would necessitate domain-specific mechanisms in the same way that your lungs serve a different function, a different purpose than your pancreas, which serves a different function from your liver. And so what evolutionary psychologists argue is, number one, the brain is made up of mechanisms that have evolved through natural and sexual selection. Number two, the brain is made up of both domain general and domain specific mechanisms. And then thirdly, it, it implies that we're not born with empty minds that are subsequently solely filled by socialization. In other words, we come to the world with these innate biological blueprints. It's precisely what allows a 3 months old child to stare at a beautiful face longer than a non-beautiful face without having to have learned that, right? By definition, they don't yet have the cognitive development to have learned or to have been socialized to that, yet they already exhibit that perceptual bias, correct? And so therefore, the idea that we are born tabula rasa, empty brain, empty slate, is profoundly incorrect. And what that basically then means is that humans are a amalgamation of their culture and their biology. No serious evolutionist, no serious evolutionary psychologist rejects the idea that socialization matters or that culture matters. Of course, these things exist, but incidentally, they exist because of biology. And therefore, you and I are an inextricable mix of both our biology and our environments. So a long but very rigorous and I hope complete answer to your question.
No, that was excellent. That I so I don't have a degree in psychology or anything, but my father's a psychologist, and I'm personally interested very much in social psychology, but didn't have any background at all in evolutionary psychology. So I really appreciate that intro.
No worries.
So you've sort of situated yourself as an evolutionary psychologist, expert in consumer marketing. What talk to me about the relationship between the two and why you sort of discovered or why you feel that they go so well together.
Right. So I guess I'll give you very briefly just a bit of the background of how I had this epiphany, and then I'll explain what evolutionary consumer psychology, evolutionary consumer behavior is. So in my first semester as a doctoral student at Cornell University, I had taken an advanced social psychology course. This wasn't an evolutionary psychology course. It was, as I said, a social psychology course. But somewhere around, I don't remember exactly when, roughly around halfway through the semester, the professor in question assigned to us a book called Homicide by two seminal evolutionary psychologists, a husband and wife team, Margot Wilson and Martin Daly. And what in the book, what they did is they applied the lens of evolutionary psychology, or more generally of evolutionary principles, to study patterns of criminality. In other words, they wanted to demonstrate that there are certain realities that take place when it comes to criminal behaviors, to criminal phenomena that transcend time, that transcend culture, that have nothing to do with poverty and with, watching, violent Hollywood movies and so on, right? So you could go to the Yanomamo tribe in the Amazon and see that there are certain patterns of criminality that are exactly the same as those that might happen at Oxford in England today as we speak. So what might be some examples of those? So, for example, the most dangerous person in a woman's life throughout all of recorded history is not the serial rapist that lurks in a tree, but rather it's her long-term partner, her long-term male partner. And that holds true across all cultures. And the thing that would trigger him to exhibit violence towards her, whether it be beat her up or go as far as to kill her, is because of either suspected or realized infidelity. In other words, it's the exact same trigger around the world 1,000 years ago and 1,000 years from now across every possible known culture that it's the exact same thing that will drive a man to maniacal, murderous rage. And of course, then the question is, so why does that happen? Well, of course, it happens because you and I have had ancestors who really cared about their women not straying from them. Now, why should they care about that? Because we're a biparental species, meaning that both men and women invest very heavily in the rearing of their children. Not men, not as much as women, but certainly men in the human species much more than any other males of any other species,
Sure.
and there, or certainly of any other mammalian species, and therefore it is profoundly suboptimal for me to not care about the possibility that I might be cuckolded, that I might spend 18 years, 20 years, 30 years of my life investing heavily in little Johnny, who regrettably has been sired by somebody else. Therefore, men evolve the cognitive, the emotional, the behavioral systems that seek to thwart that possibility, right? We didn't evolve with DNA paternity testing,
Hmm.
and therefore the way that we ensure paternity certainty is by responding very harshly to any possible transgressions. Just to give you another quick example from their work, uh, do you? And I'll ask you this not to test you, but I just want to. I'm very curious to see what you might say.
Sure.
Do you know what is the number one greatest predictor of a child being abused in a home? In other words, there's one reality which, if it exists in the home, has a 100 time greater factor than anything else of there being abuse. What do you think that is? I mean, is it poverty? Is it if I live in a certain zip code? Is it if it's sunny outside? What is it?
Oh, I don't know. I'm worried. I have kids.
Yeah, okay. Are they your biological kids?
They are, yes. I don't abuse
That,
them, so I hope I don't exhibit the trait.
well, the fact that I asked you, are they your biological kids, and you answered
Oh, sure.
yes, you're in the clear. The number one factor is if there's a step parent in the family structure,
Yeah.
and this is, as a matter of fact, coined by Wilson and Daly, the two evolutionary psychologists in question, is referred to as the Cinderella effect, right?
Yeah.
Uh, Fables exist in their form because they speak to biological imperatives, right? And so Cinderella's stepmother is differentially mean to her and less so to her biological children, again, because we've evolved the emotional and affective calculus that makes us not met out our investments equally, irrespective of the genetic relatedness or lack thereof across people, right? This is why when male lions, are running a pride. But by the way, boy, I'm giving you an evolutionary psychology lesson that suggests that you and Nir will owe me a big bill. Yeah, yeah, right. I mean, I think this might be more than your whole Oxford education, but let's go on. Uh, I'm kidding, by the way.
No,
Don't think
but
I'm
but
saying.
I love it too. Like I'm gonna ask you for other books you recommend too, but you can continue now.
Sure. So when there are two or three resident dominant male lions who are heading the pride, they're constantly being tested by other young male lions who are looking to take over the pride, who are feeling sexually frustrated, who wish to have sexual access to the lionesses. But then the two or three or one dominant males will rebuff their attempts until one day the ugly reality of nature is that those resident males will either be killed or will be driven out of the pride, and the new kings come in. And what do you think is the first thing that they do?
Oh, they killed the cubs, right?
That's right, right? They kill the cubs not because they're mean, not because they learned it from Oprah show, not because they are nasty song lyrics, not because they watched violent video games, but because nature has built in a mechanism that only cares about cold calculational realities, which is a male lion doesn't want to waste his energy its energy investing in the genetic package of another male. And incidentally, just as a side note, when these new leaders of the pride kill all the cubs, guess what happens to the females of the pride? Do you know?
Uh, no, I have no idea.
They go into estrus, they go into heat, they become sexually receptive. Now,
Oh,
how's
wow.
Now, how's that for foreplay? Actually, I wish to double down on this is bigger than your Oxford education, uh, because I'm giving you actually, and I say this, with some assuredness because, even though I've lectured about this a million times and written about this in a million ways, I still remain uh, bewildered by how powerful the explanatory power of evolutionary theory is. It is the singular greatest idea that humans have ever come up with. But in any case, and so they go into estrus because, well, what better way to then ensure that their genetic lineage is assured than to respond in, yes, a apparently grotesque way, right? I mean, you kill my kids and that puts me, quote, in the mood to have sex with you, but that's what ends up happening, right? And
Yeah.
so now link it back to the step parenthood. That's exactly what happens there, right? Now, I saw the power when I read that book. My epiphany happened right there. As I flipped through those pages of that book in fall 1990, my epiphany, I mean, literally the eureka moment happened. I knew that I was going to pursue my PhD study consumer psychology, consumer behavior. But then when I saw this unbelievably powerful framework, that was the genesis of me then eventually founding this discipline, which I called evolutionary consumption. But it stems from that original exposure to that book. And so what I wanted to do was to take exactly these evolutionary principles, which in this case were used to study criminal behavior, well, I would use it to study consumer behavior. And hence, that's how the field of evolutionary consumption developed. So to answer very briefly, what is evolutionary consumption? So, evolutionary consumption is then simply the idea of applying evolutionary principles to study our behaviors, our choices, our preferences when we put on our consumer hats, right? Uh, Now, here's the interesting part, or the additionally interesting part. I define consumer behavior very broadly in that it's not just consuming Coca-Cola and consuming Starbucks and consuming jeans, but we consume friendships, we consume religious narratives, we consume cultural products, we consume, if you like, mates, not in a cannibalistic way, but in a consumatory way. I have to buy gifts to my wife. That's part of gift-giving practices that happen across many animals. And so I look at consumption with a capital C. And then what I do is I argue, look, if you really want to understand some of these universal consumer drives, then you really can't have a full understanding of those drives if you leave biology out of the equation. Now, as I tell you this, you're probably listening at Oxford and saying, God damn, this makes perfect sense. No kidding, of course. Well, you may or may not be surprised that it's actually quite heretical to say what I'm saying within the social sciences. I mean, it's becoming less so because I've been doing this for over 20 years, and more people are realizing that, of course, consumers are biological. But until I came along, it was completely heretical to argue that consumers are biological, right? For most social scientists, what makes us human is that we transcend our biology, right?
Hmm.
Biology is relevant for the zebra, biology is relevant for the mosquito and for the salamander, but don't you dare use those same principles to explain my behaviors, and certainly don't try to explain consumer behavior. Consumer behavior comes from what we learn in advertising and in Hollywood images and in Elle magazine and from our parents. What does that have to do with biology? And so I had to be very patient and systematic and rigorous in demonstrating to people that, yes, of course, culture matters and of course, Elle magazine matters. But ultimately, if you fully want to understand the global consumer, you have to understand the biological heritage that shapes all those consumers. So there you have it. Geez, I think I just gave my whole talk at habit. I'm done.
That this is I love this. This is really awesome. Thanks so much. I want to. Can we talk a little bit specifically? So the audience, the Habit Summit audience, is there's a lot of tech company product managers and marketers and people building stuff or people working for big companies building stuff. And so to specifically to that type of audience, and you've sort of alluded to this already. As I was going through some of your research and those things, I noticed that gender is a frequent topic that comes up. And so the question I have is, as sort of a simple practical exercise for somebody who's in those roles I just described, what's something that they should know about gender that they could immediately apply to the effect that it would improve their, for example, their user experience on their website or the marketing that they do?
Sure. So I mean, I'll answer this in two ways. I'll first answer it in a general way, and then I can maybe drill down to the gender issue.
Sure.
So in a very broad sense, the practical implications and applications of what we're talking about are limitless. And let me just give a few examples. So again, I'm now giving you some general guidelines, and then I'll drill down to the gender one.
Yeah.
So take, for example, something like local versus global advertising. If I am Coca-Cola, this, by the way, now we're getting into sort of your stuff that typical MBA would be interested in. Let's suppose I'm Coca-Cola and I'm developing an advertising campaign from Atlanta. Should I develop one global message, one global campaign, which I then transport across cultures? Or should I have a local advertising strategy whereby I tweak the message to fit all of the idiosyncratic local cross-cultural differences?
Yeah.
Well, that debate, that local versus global debate, has been going on for 80 years, and it hasn't been resolved. And some people say global is better, some people say local, some people say glocal. There's all sorts of debates, and practitioners think one thing, and academics think another. And so I came along and I said that the way you actually resolve that very practical problem, right, is through an understanding of evolutionary psychology. And so now let me briefly explain how you do that. There are certain things in advertising that are universally understood in exactly the same way. So if I use a facially symmetric endorser when I'm selling a beauty product, there is no culture where they would respond by saying, oh, gee, this facially symmetric person, why did they pick that person? They're so ugly. Mm-hmm. Because facial symmetry is understood and it is responded to in exactly the same way across cultures because it is a universal marker of beauty, because it relates to phenotypic quality. And therefore, I can take the idea of using a facially symmetric person and be assured that everybody will understand it the same way. On the other hand, color connotations, green might be construed as disease, as a symbol of disease in one culture. It might be construed as a symbol of fertility in another culture. And therefore, color connotations might be bound by culture-specific realities. And so therefore, understanding which cues in advertising are universally transportable, hence global, and which ones are culturally determined, hence local, is very much within what evolutionary psychology allows me to do. So that's one practical example. Let me give you another practical example, which actually will inherently speak to the sex difference. Hardcore pornography is almost exclusively consumed by men. Mm-hmm. Romance novels are almost exclusively consumed by women. There is no culture that's ever been uncovered, and I can assure you today that there will never be a culture that will ever be uncovered in the future where what I just said does not hold true. Across otherwise incredibly diverse cultures, right? So the cultures couldn't be any more different from one another, yet the porno effect that I just mentioned and the romance novel effect that I just mentioned are exactly the same across cultures. Now, why is that? Well, it's because those particular products, porn and romance novels, they deliver a key selling point that is very much sex specific. It specifically plays on sex differences in mating behaviors and mating desires, and then it amplifies them through the products that are being delivered. So, in the case of pornography, uh, it's not as though we have a gene for porn, which, of course, sometimes people wrongly think that that's what I'm arguing. Of course not. But what we do have an evolved system is for men to have a great desire for multiple mating opportunities with readily available nubile, fertile women. They have a physiology, men that is easily visually aroused, because if you wish to have many multiple short-term mating opportunities, then you'd want to have a physiology that responds very quickly. And therefore, now you take pornography, it piggybacks on exactly those realities, right? So pornography says, hey, I could offer you a product where you get on the internet and you could surf for unlimited number of readily available nubile fertile women that are, quote, available to mate with you. Well, guess what? That's why the great majority of porn addicts online are men, not women. When it comes to romance novels, the way you would, how does that cater to women? Well, it turns out that if you want to study the male archetype in a romance novel, he is exactly the same guy across all romance novels. I mean, it borders on plagiarism. It's as if it's the same writer in Romania and in Japan and in Egypt and in Nigeria that has copied the exact same archetype. Who is that archetype? He's tall. He is a risk taker. He's reckless, except for the ability of this one woman to tame him. He's a wrangler of crocodiles on his bare chest with the six pack. He's a count, right? A prince and a neurosurgeon. And therefore, what are romance novels doing? They are catering to female evolved desires, right? There is no romance novel where the male archetype is a pear-shaped, lazy, apathetic, socially submissive, whiny voiced schmuck, right? That's not how it works. Why? Because the marketers of this product understand what women want, and the marketers of porn understand what men want. And so, without having to read my books, without knowing the fancy scientific reasons behind all those preferences, they instinctually understand what it is that men and women desire. And so now to come to your specific question, so I've given you now an example of sex differences. Well, there are all sorts of uh, ergonomic choices, design choices. How do people navigate through information? How much information do men and women acquire before they make a choice? All of those things that may or may not be relevant in the context of tech companies actually have certain sex differences. And some of these sex differences, not all of them, but some of them are rooted in biological realities. So let me just give you one very, very quick example.
Sure.
I did a study with two of my former graduate students where I looked at, and this is kind of relevant for, say, an online dating application, okay? So we looked at using computer interfaces. We had people come and sort of go through these computer interfaces where they were choosing, between competing mates, very much how you would do in an online dating situation. And so a couple of things that we were looking at, but let me just mention two very quick ones. We wanted to look at how much information do men and women look at, specifically when choosing between mates, before they reject mates, and how much then do they look at information before they ultimately choose a final mate. And now here is the incredible insights, if I may say. When it comes to rejection data, women actually reject suitors much more quickly than men do. In other words, it takes a lot less convincing for a woman to say, I'm walking away from these mating prospects than it does for men. On the other hand, when it comes to choice data, when it comes to actually making a choice, I'm going to go with this mate, then women acquire more information than men. So for rejection data, they look at less information. For choice data, they look at more information. Now, what could explain this biologically? So here we turn to a profoundly profound theory known as parental investment theory, proposed by Robert Trivers, whereby he basically said that if you want to understand sex differences across species, including humans, look at the minimal obligatory parental investment that is required by each of the two sexes. Typically, the female of a species is required of her much more minimal parental investment. And of course, in the human context, that's profoundly the case, right? Women go through gestation, men don't. Women have only up to 400 eggs from the onset of the menses to menopause. Men have 250 million spermatozoa in a single ejaculation. Therefore, the gametes, the reproductive cells of women, are incredibly scarce and valuable, and those of men are incredibly frequent and non-valuable. Women have to go through the threats of childhood, mortality as you're giving birth, childbearing mortality. So there are all sorts of things that tip the parental investment much more toward women. Therefore, we would expect that if women stand to have a much greater cost in making a suboptimal mate choice, they would be more judicious in making mate choices. Therefore, they reject people more quickly, and they are much choosier when they're finally making a choice. So here's an example where I took a theory that you would think is, completely biological. I mean, this is very serious evolutionary biology stuff. And then I'm able to apply it very much in a consumer choice, in this case, choosing between mates. And in the case of your tech question, I mean, in an online dating application website, I could make very, very specific predictions about online behaviors, browsing behaviors of men and women, very much related to evolutionary psychology. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's awesome. So I'm sensitive to your time. Are you okay to keep going?
How much more do you think we have? Just because I've got young children, I want to know sort of how to plan it. How much more do you think you need? I mean, there's no problem, but just tell
I'd say 10 more minutes probably
Okay,
is, yeah.
fine, go.
Um, yeah, so I noticed another word that came up a lot in your research and some of your YouTube videos was a lot about emotions and hormones. And you've touched on this too, but I sort of had the same question. Like, if I'm, what's a really simple like point of information that you could give to a marketer that would help them regarding hormones and emotions that people feel online,
Sure,
that would help them
sure.
like improve their marketing?
So the general idea, I guess, again, sort of to start with a general response, the decisions that we make don't exist outside of our biology, right? So, for example, if I go grocery shopping, the situational hunger that I'm experiencing when I'm grocery shopping will have an effect on how big my final grocery shopping bucket is. In other words, if I'm more hungry, assuming that I don't just stick to a predetermined shopping list, right? I only went to the store to buy eggs and milk and cheese, right? If I'm just going for my weekly shopping, I'll end up shopping for more food precisely because I just happen to be hungrier then. So this mechanism whereby my blood sugar is now lower because I'm hungry will cause me to subconsciously hoard more food. Therefore, our emotional system, our physiological system, our endocrinological system don't suddenly become unimportant and irrelevant when we put on our hats as consumers or as marketers or as employers or as employees. And therefore, what I do in all of my work is I systematically try to Darwinize the business school, right? So I started with consumer behavior, but then I've got a book that's titled Evolutionary Psychology in the Business Sciences, meaning that these ideas of evolutionary psychology don't just apply in the way that I do, apply them in consumer behavior, but you could also study personnel psychology using evolutionary psychology. You could study financial trading and behavioral economics and so on. So
Mm-hmm.
going back to the question of, what can marketers do with our understanding of hormones? Well, so my my hormones affect the decisions that I make. If I'm experiencing currently a surge of testosterone that is increasing my libidinal drives, I might make decisions A, B, or C differently than if I weren't under that endocrinological state. So let's take a very concrete example. I did a study, and maybe that's one of the ones that you were referring to, where I tracked women's behaviors, preferences, desires across their menstrual cycles,
Mm-hmm.
precisely under the expectation that they would have different consumer related preferences and purchases as a function of where they were in their menstrual cycles. And how is that related to hormones? Well, of course, there's a whole bunch of hormones that wax and wane differently depending on where a woman is in her ovulatory cycle. So, for example, when she is in the maximally fertile phase of her cycle, then she engages in greater beautification. She engages in more sexual signaling. She wears shorter skirts. She wears more makeup. When she is in the luteal phase, the non-fertile phase, that's when she's more likely to succumb to food-related drives. So if I am a diet marketer and I know this reality, then I might want to remind women that their ability to stick to the diet, right? I'm Weight Watchers. Their ability to stick to the diet might wax and wane in a way that is consistent with their where they are in their ovulatory cycle. Hey, ladies, be careful! You're entering day 28 of your cycle. That extra piece of cake might be that much more alluring to you. So, in other words, there's an endless number of ways that marketers can, you know, incorporate this knowledge once they, at the very least, recognize that hormones matter. Now, the reality is that until I came along, this discussion was never had, right? As a matter of fact, let me ask you, I don't know how long you've been at Oxford. Have you ever heard the words biology uttered in your MBA at Oxford?
Oh, I don't know. We do an awful lot of talking about the environment, but
But no
I
biology.
don't think so. Yeah.
Well, there you go, right? So you're going to go to one of the premier universities in the world. You're going to get an MBA from one of the premier universities in the world, and you're going to get out with that MBA whilst fully, perfectly unaware and uninterested in the fact, well, not uninterested because you might be interested, but certainly untrained in the reality that everything that you do when you put on a business hat is ultimately affected by your biology. And surely that has to matter, right? So let me give you an example from financial trading. We know that actually, this is from the London Stock Exchange, from the London floor, London, England. Uh, there's a study that was done, I think that they were from Cambridge, not Oxford, where these scientists looked at men's testosterone levels. These are financial traders, men's circulating testosterone levels in the morning and their subsequent performance that day trading. And then they also looked at men's cortisol levels, right? Cortisol is a stress response hormone, and their cortisol levels, how they went up and down throughout the day, was beautifully correlated to something in the market. Can you guess what it was?
Oh, I don't know.
Oh, the volatility of the market. In other words, if the market was very stable, right, there wasn't these big fluctuations of up and down in the market, then their cortisol levels were also very tame. If the market was swinging wildly up, down, that's what causes stress. Therefore, their hormones, specifically as tracked in this case by their cortisol levels, went up and down accordingly. And so, in retrospect, when I now say this, you go, yeah, of course it makes sense. Obviously, their hormones have to affect the types of decisions that they make. So ultimately, the idea is that whatever we knew so far about consumer behavior and marketing is great. Of course, we know tons of stuff, right? But it could only be improved. You could only have a better explanation of consumer behavior if you now suddenly incorporate all of this biological knowledge, right? I mean, it can't be otherwise, right? I mean, we didn't know anything about the microscopic level of molecules until we had the electronic microscope that allows us to see things at that level, right? By the same token, the evolutionary lens unpacks things for you about human nature that would otherwise have been invisible to you. You follow what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so as a marketer, I could say this: a good marketer, maybe that's a quote I should use in ending my talk at Habit, a good marketer is ultimately an expert on human nature, right? I mean, he or she may not know the formal scientific ideas that I'm talking about, but he has a good pulse of what it means to have a human nature, and therefore he or she will make decisions that are consistent with that human nature, right? There was a company that tried a few years ago, and I don't remember the name of the company, going back to the romance novel example, that tried to break through the quote sexist stereotypes of male masculinity, right? They wanted to create a new vision of a new millennium male in terms of romance novels. Can you guess what happened to that initiative, Max?
Failed.
Thank you, sir. It failed because they started off, those marketers, with the wrong understanding of human nature, which is they thought that human nature is infinitely malleable. You start with an empty brain, and it's socialization that teaches you. So if you want to teach women to like a gentleman who cries while listening to Taylor Swift music, well, then just teach them that, and that's what they will love. Well, guess what? That's not how it works, right? So yes, there are differences across consumers, and yes, there are differences across cultures, but these differences are still constrained within biological limits, right? You can't offer consumers something that is outside the purview of what their human nature allows them, right? So, for example, the reason why McDonald's is so popular around the world is not because they've got great advertising, although one could argue that they have good advertising. It's because they offer a product that is perfectly consistent with with what my gustatory preferences desire, which is fatty, high calorie, tasty foods that are cheap, right? If you gave me grass juice and raw celery and put me all the celebrities in the world to endorse it with a $60 billion advertising budget, it would fail. It would fail because that's not what my taste buds want. They want fatty fries. Okay. So that's bottom line is, it's amazing that we even understand consumer behavior having neglected biology so much. Does that give you a good sense?
Yes. Yeah. That's okay. So we're out of time. The one last question.